for the next 15-20 minutes or so, it is my task to tell you something about what we know about sea mills. And Kate is absolutely correct. We've literally got hundreds and hundreds of boxes of material that have been collected over the last 120 odd years or so by a variety of different people, both amateur archaeologists, antiquarians and professional archaeologists, and also people who have found things in their back garden. So for those of you who are not tuning in from Bristol, I thought I'd just like to point out that even though Bristol does not develop from a Roman settlement in the same way as, for example, Bath developed from Aquae Sulis, we do have a lot of Roman material and sites in and around our city, let alone the Roman town of Aboni. That's a quote just there from the chairman of the museum committee in 1899. And that little map just there was produced in the 1980s and is considerably more populated now than those selected sites you can see. This is the site that we're going to be talking about today, Aboni. Clearly, we're also responsible within the museum service for the villa site at King's Weston. And just looking at that list of different types of places, whether they're rural settlements, villas, temples, etc., there's quite a lot of those places that Bristol has material from. So we have a really good representative range of material from all different types of sites, whether it's Roman villas, temples, rural settlements, or sea mills itself. So the other lines that you can see on the map just there are suggested roads. So there is a road that comes from Bath all the way out through to what is now sea mills. If you're up early or out late of an evening along the downs, you'll be able to see along Ladies Mile, where the sun shines across the surface of the grass, the line of the Roman road, which actually still exists underneath the grass coming out towards Aboni, and then also running north to south. So going across up the side of the Severn Estuary and off towards Gleetham or Gloucester, as we would call it today. So a whole range of different types of sites across the city. And then just to bring it down so that you know exactly where we're talking about in terms of sea mills and the river system, because this is important. So we have the River Severn just here. We have the Avon just here that comes all the way through into Bristol and then on to Bath. But we also have the River Trim, which goes up to the north. And the Roman site that we're talking about sits at the confluence of the Trim. And we know that there was lots of activity that's known about from a Roman perspective. It starts to be noted from at least the 18th century onwards. So some of the city historians have written about it. And then things that start to come out of the ground. So a huge amount of activity already known about before we even start to dig in any kind of professional sense of the term. And then coming down even more close up to exactly where we're talking about. So this is the River Avon just here, and this is the Trim, and this is what I'm talking about. It sits within this corner that is hemmed in on two sides by the river. And then there's a railway line that goes all the way through the site. And that actually is where the first kind of antiquarian interest, finding of finds by Frederick Ellis took place when the Sea Mills railway station was being built in 1893. And from that point forward, lots of infrastructure and other kinds of development that take place in this area start to bring objects and walling, hobbling, all different kinds of things to the fore. And so we have a lot of things that come out of the ground from the 1910s onwards with the building of the Portway. So if you are familiar with the main road, which comes in from the motorway from the M5 that brings all the traffic along the side of the River Avon, the Portway was constructed in the 1920s, and that went straight through this site as well. So that opened up the area to even more interest. And then later on, in the 1930s and then the 1940s, we start to get the construction of housing in and around this area just here. And I'll show you a closer up map of what goes on just there. And then obviously it is quite useful that all of these places are now named after particular Roman emperors, or indeed Roman way just here. So we have Hadrian Close. It's easy to remember when you're there that the Roman site is actually there, even if you can see very little of it. This map shows you the probable extent of the site, and that is because we don't know where the edges of the town actually were. There has been no full-blown excavation, and I'll explain a little bit more about that as we go along. But you can see there are some sites that are marked on here that show where Roman buildings have been discovered. This is the only one that you can see any of the remains of, and I'll show you a bigger picture in the next slide or so. And then the other thing you can see just here, there are inhumation and cremations which are outside of what might be described as the city walls. So burial sites outside of the main settlement, which is probably why we're defining the edges of this town in this way. And just to say a little bit about why we call it Aboni, so it's referenced in something called the Antonine Itinerary, which is actually a list of roads and all the staging places along those roads that was done for the emperor. And there is a reference to a place called Aboni in there. And it's not really until about 1970 that it becomes fully agreed by academics and others that this is the settlement site that goes by that name. But from that point forward, obviously for the last 50 years or so, this is definitely what we would call it and what we've continued to call it. So a huge amount of different types of finds, for example, whether it's buildings, whether it's streets, whether it's tombstones, whether it's quarries that have been used to build it. One of the first things that came out of the ground is this, and it's probably my most favourite thing, Roman thing of all the collections, and you can see it on display at Emshed in the People Gallery. And that's a tombstone, and it's really important as far as we're concerned. It was found in 1872 by some builders who were working on a plateau just above the Sea Mill settlement. And obviously it's broken, but you can see the front has been carved with the face of a woman. It's a very crudely drawn face. She appears to be wearing some form of hood. If you look very closely, she's got nice dangly earrings on. And then this sometimes is described as hair. I like to think of it more as a fur hood that she's wearing. She's sitting underneath what probably is a niche, so inside an altar place. She has to her right a cock and to her left a dog, and then we've got some palmate leaves just here. And the really obvious thing is the writing. So it's the only inscribed piece of Roman stonework that we've actually got from the whole of the Bristol city area. And that is an inscription which means for the hope of Gaius Sentius. So you can see the C Senti just here means Gaius Sentius. That's the first person for whom we have a name, the earliest person that we have a name for that came from the Bristol area. And underneath the tombstone we also found the remains of a young woman, skeletal remains, which have been radiocarbon dated. So about 1700 years ago, somebody commissioned this stone to be made and then buried either his wife or daughter potentially under that stone and memorialized her. And the one aspect that I've not mentioned is this, which is this little star shape, and also the fact that we've got this triangular form to it. One of the suggestions has been that this is quite common on Gallic tombstones, and this is also a shape that you see in Gaul for tombstones. And so the question arises as to who Gaius Sentius was. Was Gaius Sentius somebody who came to Aboni, to Sea Mills? Was he somebody who was a trader there? Was he somebody who was passing through? All we know is that he was likely to be related to the person that was buried beneath the tombstone. I always like to give an idea of who is responsible for collecting the evidence, and these are three photographs of three people that are quite important in terms of gathering the evidence. I've mentioned an antiquarian called Frederick Ellis. There's also Mr. Trapman. Then there's Dina Portway Dobson Hinton, who starts excavating in the 1930s in and around where the prefab sites are, sitting alongside the River Avon. In the centre, we have an antiquarian who was also an archaeologist in this respect called Alfred Selly. Alfred Selly also field walked and was generally interested in flint, but did some excavation. I can show you some images shortly of him. And then on the right-hand side, George Counsell Boone, who became a preeminent archaeologist. He was in charge of National Museum of Wales, Roman archaeology, coin specialist. He's got lots of coins sitting there in front of him. He started working on the sites at Sea Mills, or being interested on the sites at Sea Mills, from the age of 11 onwards. And it was because of the work of Dina Portway Dobson Hinton that he became interested in archaeology and then started to correspond with the museum. So he corresponded with Dr. Wallace, who was the director at the time, Dr. Wallace would provide George with money to pay people who were building along the site for any fines that came out of the ground. Some of those people being German prisoners of war. Some of the finds that come out of the site that give us a little bit of information about when it began to develop. So we're talking about something, the town as a whole, or the settlement that we know as Abonai, is really there from the 1st to the 4th century. And we know that there's very early settlement there after the conquest, the Roman conquest of Britain, 43 AD. So probably from about the 60s onwards, there were people living in this area. And the reasons I put these objects on the screen is because in the top left, you can see the stamp of the 2nd Augustan Legion. And they had a legionary based at Caerleon, which is just the other side of the River Severn, to the mouth of the Avon, and therefore very close to Seamills. And the suggestion is that there was probably a military installation of some description on this side, on the Bristol side of the Severn, which then accumulated civilian followings. There was a market for goods to be bought by any soldiers that were stationed in the area. And then very quickly, the soldiers or the military moved out, but the civilian settlement remained. But there still seems to have been this connection between the other side of the river and Bristol. We get them on tiles, we get them on bricks. There are seasonal activity for the army to be making. And it's quite possible that material that was coming in from abroad and to other places were utilising the river to supply troops on the other side of the river that were stationed at Caerleon, and that's why you get the connection. In the bottom left, you can see there are 2 small military fittings, and those coins on the right-hand side, they're actually the dark green ones, which are really heavily patinated. They're all made out of copper alloy. They're imitation coins of Claudius, so the emperor who was responsible for the invasion. And they are contemporary imitations that were made at the time. So they're not fakes that have been made by somebody today. They've actually been made to facilitate any kind of trade. And I've just given you an example of what the real ones would look like at the bottom, which I've taken from the Portable Antiquities website, just to give you an indication of what the designs would really look like. But they're an indication of the early settlement of the area. And then what we know is that that civilian settlement goes through at least 2 phases of building. There are at least timber buildings to start off with, and then there are stone buildings, and that exists for at least 3 to 4 centuries before the end of the Roman Empire period, the colonization as we would know it. I'm just going to go back to that extant site. And you remember I showed you a picture of Mr. Selly. That's him just here. He is standing on the side of a site that he excavated, which was on the corner of Roman Way. So if you want to go along to Seamills and visit the only extant open area of Roman building, that's where to go. And here he is, just here, still wearing his hat and his overcoat, wielding some really, not really kind of like typical excavation implement just there in the form of a garden fork. But you can see this is where the river is along here, and this is where the portway comes in at the side. So he was responsible for doing excavation there in 1934, and that site has been left open, and this is pretty much what it looks like today. It is not, as its label used to say, any kind of military headquarters. What it looks like is part of a workshop which is associated with a street of workshops which ran along in this direction. So it's rooms associated with another building. It's not a military headquarters in any way, shape or form. I mentioned George Boon and the fact that he was given money to ply all of those people that were building in this area for fines. And this is one I managed to track down from the archives. So it's a little silver finger ring. It's quite badly damaged. You can see that it's missing some of its mounts. It's got a little blue glass intaglio just here that has been clumsily glued back in. But this is one of the things that I know that he found and acquired for the museum from those people that were working on that site to build prefabs. And as we all know, prefabs were the kinds of buildings that were being produced to house people when there was a housing shortage during and after the Second World War. This is a plan from the archive that accompanies Boon's material. So we would normally know George Boon as the person responsible for one of the two people responsible for the discovery and excavation of the Roman villa site out at King's Weston. But because of the work that he'd been doing with Dina Portway Dobson Hinton, he was given permission to undertake some work in and around where the prefabs were. And this is where all the lines of the prefabs are. Now, what you need to know about prefabs is that they're all built on concrete platforms, which means all the archaeology is sealed perfectly beneath them because there are no deep foundations. And this is the plan, which was produced by the City Engineers Department in the late 1940s to show where some of the things were that were found relative to those particular sites. And if you look at the top just here, we've got a nice picture of a Samian bowl, which I will show to you. But this is also the work of George Boone and his friend John Clevedon Brown, who went on to do the villa in terms of excavation. And this is a photograph of them examining some of the human remains, which also came from the site. So there were several skeletons that were excavated at the same time. This is the bowl. It's a Samian ware bowl. So the Roman conquest, new types of materials start to be imported into the country. The idea that sea mills would be a Roman port is supported by some of the materials that are found there. And this is one of them. It's a more exotic tableware. It's very hard. It's a high gloss pottery, but it's not glazed. It has a slip on the outside of it. There is a huge manufacturing of this going on in Gaul from the 1st and 2nd centuries, first in southern Gaul and then in central Gaul, and a limited number of shapes. So this is form number 33, and you can see that it's been decorated with this egg and dart decoration just here, but we've also got panels with little cupids and birds that go around the outside of it, and they're impressed into a mould and also wheel thrown in order to be able to produce this. It's a very, very typical Roman import. It's the kind of thing that gets copied as well. So it's been brought in, new different types of pottery and other types of things being imported from elsewhere. Other things that were found mainly during the 1960s. So in terms of excavation, we have excavation from the 1910s right up to the 1940s, and then we get house building in the 1960s, and a huge amount of excavation taking place, some by the Bristol Archaeological Research Group, which is now Bristol and Avon Archaeology Society, some under the auspices of the City Museum. So things that have been put together, and that wasn't actually synthesized in publication until 1987. So if you want to read all about all of those excavations in one place, I would recommend that you visit the Bristol and Gloucestershire Archaeology Society website and look at the transactions and simply put in a search for sea mills, and you will find Pete Ellis's report on the 1960s excavations, but a whole range of information that tells you about artifacts like this. So on the left-hand side, we've got a small copper alloy figurine of Jupiter. On the right-hand side, we've got some personal items. So we have a trumpet-headed brooch that's got the remains of blue and red enamel in the disc on the top of it. And then also personal toiletry implements. So the large item in the center is a pair of tweezers. One of the others will be a nail pick, and then an ear scoop for cleaning your ears instead of using a cotton bud. And then other things which are a little bit more exotic. These are not whole objects, and obviously the two on the right are the same object seen from a different perspective. These are handles that come from metal flagons, and they're also likely to have been imported into sea mills. On the left-hand side, you can see the bottom of the handle has been decorated with a Medusa head, and you can see all of the snakes around here. Whereas at the bottom here, we've got a three-dimensional figure, and you can see wings on his back just here, and he appears to be carrying something. Now, if you read Pete Ellis's interpretation of this object, or this handle which went onto a flagon-shaped metal vessel, that figure is described as a cupid. But actually, more recently, it's probably more likely to be Ganymede, so the cupbearer to the gods, who was taken away to live with the gods by Zeus, masquerading as an eagle. So likely to be Ganymede, and this is also something that's imported into the site. Other pieces of stonework apart from our lovely tombstone, you can also see this on display at Emshed, is this altar for making offerings. Now, unlike some of the other altars that we've got in the collection, This has no writing on it. It just has symbols. So we have an eagle, we have a trident, we have a bull, and the suggestion is here that this is where people made offerings. You did a deal with the gods, essentially. I give you something in return for something. And this is one of the altars that was set up at the site. And then just a little bit more evidence of things that are coming in. This is a trading port. And so these are the handles of another type of pottery. This is a replica Roman amphora. And they were used for importing large quantities of olive oil, also a fish sauce called liquamen, and wine. And they're stamped. This one on the right just here has the stamp for somebody called Gaius Antonius Quietus, who lived in southern Spain. He can be identified. He lived in southern Spain, and materials that he was producing in terms of olive oil, for example, were being imported, and potentially wine in his amphora were being imported into Sea Mills 2,000 years ago. Bringing it up slightly to more to the present day, as I said before, there has been no synthesis of all the material until the 1980s. And there has been no overall excavation of the site, and that is largely because it is a residential area. So unlike the city today, where we would normally see lots of development, redevelopment as offices go up and down, residential development changes very slowly over time. So it doesn't afford the same possibility for excavations. There have been some work recently that was done in and around the prefabs on Hadrian Close, which showed up some really important survivals from the 1st and 2nd century AD. This is a piece of work to look at that Roman site on the end of Roman Way by a group that got together called the Sea Mills Archaeological Research Team. And with Peter Insoll from the Historic Environment Office in Urban Design, they went to re-examine some of the records that we had for the site. That was probably about 10 or 11 years ago. But we have not been afforded the possibility of doing any kind of major excavation, but we do have a massive resource for people to come and search. And one of those ways of expressing the resource we've got is through the Know Your Place website. So if you want to find out more about what's been found at Sea Mills, the Roman town of Aboni, all you need to do is go to the Bristol Know Your Place website. It's easy to find on the internet. And if you put in Sea Mills and a search or Roman Way at the top into the search field, it'll take you directly to this area. And each one of these represents some kind of investigation that will tell you more about the Roman site at Sea Mills. That's where I'm going to come to an end. I realise it's a very quick run through of some of the finds and some of the information that's come out of the ground. But if anybody's got any questions, I'll try and answer them. Thank you.